Long-term care homes are not extensions of hospitals. We are places where people live.
How can a set of skills lead you down the path to success? That's what we're setting out to answer on the EdUp Canada podcast. I'm your host, Michael Sangster. Join me as we unpack how leaders around the world have taken training and skills and turned that into a lasting career. Now let's learn together. Hello, and welcome back to the EdUp Canada podcast, where we explore the people, programs, and stories shaping the future of Canada's most vital industries. In this week's episode, we'll discuss the Canadian healthcare sector, which is facing a shortage of valuable, skilled workers. More specifically, we'll be focused on long-term care. Joining me this week is Jodi Hall, the CEO of the Canadian Association of Long-Term Care. Jodi began her career in long-term care as a nurse before joining the association and is now the national voice of the long-term care sector in Canada. The Canadian Association of Long-Term Care is a trusted source of information on federal long-term care matters, common issues facing Canada's provinces and territories, and emerging issues in the long-term care sector. I'm looking forward to the discussion today as we delve into the challenges facing her sector. And with that, I'd like to welcome Jodi, who's become a bit of a friend, but I'm interested in the conversation today because COVID just made this relevant to everybody, didn't it, Jodi?
Oh, indeed. And thanks so much, Michael, for the invitation to be here.
I'm excited to have the chat, and we can jump right in. We'll get to some of our common questions that we've warned Jodi that we like to ask people because we are here talking about education. We're talking about skills and mentoring and all the things we need in this country. But what for your point of view, what is the major challenge currently facing long-term care in Canada?
Yeah. Well, in honesty, there's a lot of challenges that we're dealing with in long-term care, but by far I'd say the greatest challenge and the one that's being most consistently experienced across all of the provinces and territories in Canada is staffing shortages. It really is a critical issue. And in particular, when we talk about the care team, there's a shortage for all members of the care team, registered nurses, licensed practical nurses, and the personal support worker. Because the largest cohort of our workforce is the personal support worker. And of course, I use that title to be all encompassing of the different titles used across the country for that role.
It's Canada. We have to have 24 titles for the same job, right?
For sure. But truly, that is an area that's had a lot of attention and emphasis right across the country because of the important role they play in the workforce.
How are your members? Let's dive right into it. How are they finding qualified professionals? Obviously, the education system is a big part of that. But what trends are you seeing by the way that people are entering the workforce in your sector? And maybe touch on a little bit, what's the demand?
Yeah, well, I guess just to frame it all about the demand, some of the latest numbers that we've seen from StatsCan knows that there are over 33,000 vacancies in residential care facilities across the country. So these are all types of organizations. Some are long-term care homes. Some of them are various types of community residences and others that fall into that category, but all would be employing care team members similar to what you would have in a long-term care home, especially personal support workers. So that's an incredible number when you think about, what the need is going forward. We know that there is more long-term care home beds that are planned to be like new developments, not just replacements of existing beds across the country. So, and then you also have to think about the age of our population, which includes our workforce, which means we're anticipating a lot of retirements. So that is just sort of a nutshell summary of what we're going to need going forward. So it's been an incredible consideration about where are we recruiting from? So, certainly a lot of energy has gone into figuring out sort of what does the international opportunity look like. There's been a lot of programs that's come through with IRCC and sort of provincial programs as well, where we're able to utilize the levers, so to speak, to connect with workforce around the world who are interested to come to Canada and work in long-term care. So that's been one. Another that's been sort of a band-aid effect, effort, but it's one that's become really needed, even though it's extremely expensive, which is agency nursing. And so that's been a way that we've been able to fill gaps to ensure resident safety over the short term. But certainly, I believe that there is a lot more that we can do on domestic workforce development. And so, colleges, for when we talk about personal support workers and licensed practical nurses, have been so critically important for long term care homes and having, their efforts to shore up our workforce across the country really is incredibly important for the future.
I've heard a bit of a false narrative out there about the fact we just got to get through this bubble. There's this group of seniors rolling through, and there's a great statistic from Stats Canada that should scare every one of us. I believe it was 2020, we had 7 workers for every retiree. We're headed towards, it was before 2020, but we were 7 workers for a retiree. We're headed towards 2 workers for every retiree by 2030 in Canada. So we're living longer. There's a big bubble going through. This is not going to be a 5-year problem we need to just kind of hobble our way through. This is a long-term systemic problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think the baby boomers are close to 75, or at least in the midst of that cohort. And so that is a huge bubble in our population. And so that's where a lot of these statistics are being driven about. 1 in 4 Canadians will be over the age of 65 in a very short period of time. And so as we think about, what does that look like, the average age of people who come to long-term care, people are living longer in the community with additional supports and resources being made available there. So, we're looking at really the next 25 years where we're likely to see high demand for long-term care in particular across the country. And, there's immediate evidence to support that because I'll use the province of Ontario as an example, where there's over 45,000 people on the wait list for a long-term care home bed today. But there's record high wait list numbers right across the country. So there is an incredible need for long-term care at this time, and that's only going to grow again over the next 25 years.
Can you talk to us a little bit about how the roles changed? I know you started volunteering in the sector in high school, if I've got it correct. My information's right. I know that was just a few years ago, but maybe you can talk a little bit about how the sector's changed and the responsibilities that workers have taken on in long-term care. Has that changed as much as I think it might have?
Yeah, there's been a big transition in long-term care. And as you noted, it was actually my very first job. I was in high school and I got to work in the kitchen of a long-term care home. And it really was deeply impacting on me. I simply fell in love with residents and long-term care. And that has been largely my career path ever since. But when I think about sort of how things have transitioned, I'll share one funny story with you, or it sounds funny to say it. I have been going through some media archives of a former employer that I had. And one of the stories that we came across was from the 70s, and it was a long term care home that had recently been built. And there was a large community controversy about the fact that there wasn't enough parking spaces for the residents' cars. And so that's a stark contrast to what we see today, where people are coming with, really in need of a skilled nursing home with care staff, that's with them 24/7. So a dramatic shift in the needs of residents. And so with that comes, different skills that are required to support residents. And I would say, there's now today a greater emphasis not only on sort of that clinical side, but also the quality of life and making sure that in spite of some of these challenging conditions that residents may be living with, that they still have the opportunity to live their best life every day and are still experiencing joy and happiness. And that is such a critical part of the work that staff and long-term care home do today, in addition to ensuring that they have their care needs met.
I always ask people 2 questions. So I'm going to go to one of them now. And maybe you can morph it a little bit into the sector you work in. But what is a skill that has made Jodi successful in life? Did you have it early? Did you gain it later in life? And what then maybe if it's something that you've developed over time, but is there also a skill that's important for working in long-term care?
So I would say that the skill I'll note would also be the same for someone working in long term care. And maybe that's consistent because that's the path that I've largely come through. But that would be in my mind, certainly the ability to listen and to collaborate with a team. And not only a team in the sense that, it's your coworkers, but it's the person that you're providing care to and their families as well, and your employer. And when you have the ability to not just see the world through one lens, and fight for that, push through and push people out of the way, but when you really develop the skill to hear people, to try and understand their perspective, sometimes it's about meeting people halfway or finding solutions, developing a mutual approach to care that creates not only a productive care plan for residents, but it also creates a really productive engagement with a family where they're welcomed in part of the process. And you're also creating a very positive work environment and have really successful relationships with your colleagues. And maybe that sounds extremely basic, but it's such a critical element to be successful. And probably that's true in many fields, but in long term care, that team aspect, it's not an independent type of environment where you just go and you do things by yourself and then you can go home. You really need to have the ability to work with others, and finding successful approaches to that really is key to the success, not only for you, but for your team and for your residents as well.
Teamwork makes the dream work. And we've all heard
Indeed.
that phrase, but it really is. And not a, you don't all enter the workforce with that skill to trust the person next to you. I've had a couple of unique experiences in life. One of them, I was actually invited with General Rick Hillier into the locker room of the Ottawa Senators to talk before a big game in Winnipeg. And we're standing in there, and I'm going to talk about community. He's going to talk about leadership. We brought a local soldier in from Shiloh, Manitoba. He came up, and I spoke for a couple of minutes, and I thought I was great. And then Rick got up for a couple of minutes, and he thought he was great. And then the soldier got up and said, if you're the centerman, trust the guy on the left wing will do his job. Trust the guy on the right wing will do his job. Talk between shifts, communicate, do your job, trust the guy. And it was very interesting to have this very, very basic speech to him. And the players were ready to run out of the locker room, but he was saying something similar. Teamwork, work together. And it was a really interesting moment to be part of. And I'm going to segue into another nice night I had you're an Atlantic Canadian,
Yes.
a gentleman by the name of Rex Murphy, who we lost Rex this year, but he came out and he emceed the police gala and did a speech for me one year in Ottawa. And we had below us was the memorial service for Nathan Cirillo, who had just been shot at the War Memorial.
Right.
And Rex Murphy got up, and there is a segue here, folks. Don't worry. Rex Murphy got up to start the evening and said, "We're a stone's throw from Parliament Hill. Normally, I'd suggest we go out throw a few. Tonight doesn't seem the night because of the memorial, but that's not my approach. It's not my approach. I know you. Can we talk about some good things that governments have done for you? Because we always focus on the negative. And I can talk about PSW training in provinces like Ontario, where they funded 18,000 students and went through our programs and got to work. And then at the end of it, looked at us and went, Paul Calandra, the Minister of Long-Term Care, looked at us and said, you made a difference. You helped us turn the corner in COVID. So talk about a positive government thing or interaction you've worked through that's been good for your sector.
Yeah. Well, I think that there's been a lot of heightened attention by all governments, at both different levels, federal and provincial. And so I think that we've seen a number of investments and initiatives made right across the board over the last few years in particular. And so that collectively has been extremely positive. We've been a sector that often has, been underfunded and not invested in for development. And so that's been a positive take sort of at that high level. I think one of the things that's been quite successful, and you just referenced the experience in Ontario, but most provincial governments are covering the cost or tuition for a personal support worker training program. And so I think that has really been helpful to eliminate that for those who would have that as a barrier. So I think that's been really positive, and we've seen a number of other types of alternative programming, I'll say it that way, a bit outside of what we typically see how education is delivered for personal support workers. One example I'll share would be like in British Columbia, they have a program that's called the Health Career Access Program. It's often referred to as HCAP. And it sort of builds on this traditional concept of apprenticeship in the sense that it creates a combination of work and education at the same time. And we see some other examples across the country where governments are supporting this type of initiative. But I think that that's a really exciting thought for our future about the role that colleges could also play as we try to think about other innovative ways where colleges and employers, long-term care home employers and government can continue to collaborate to help build the workforce. So,
We spend too much time knocking governments down. I was talking to a deputy minister in Ottawa about a year ago, and she looked at me and said there was no manual on the wall that we could pull out for a pandemic, right? And I actually think governments did a remarkable good job getting through that and supporting the people who needed supporting. So let me pivot over for a different question here before I get back to your main priorities at your association these days. I hadn't thought about this till I was talking to one of our group today about the housing shortage in Canada. It also affects you, like you're housing in a different way, right?
yeah, we actually have a position paper out that's called the long-term care, the other housing crisis in Canada. And that really, I think, has helped to open up some new dialogues because it's not really been well understood that long term care homes are not extensions of hospitals. We are places where people live. We work where people live. It's a very kind of philosophical difference, but a really important one to make. And people who live in long term care homes or residents, they also contribute the funds to be able to live in these homes. And so we need to respect that it is a form of housing that's greatly needed across the country. And, there are some researchers in Canada looking at housing that have done a lot of work and looking at sort of alternative housing needs in Canada. And this certainly is one of those that I don't think has been given sufficient consideration. So for us, this absolutely is a housing discussion. It's one that we're certainly talking to government about. We'd love to see the re-engagement of CMHC to support long-term care housing development in Canada. It's not easy to access capital dollars to do that.
I would have assumed that that is a priority for them, but I guess not.
Well, it was in the past. There are these models. It's how a lot of these long-term care homes that we know today that are now like 50 years old, they had those resources in place and under a program that was available through CMHC and the provincial governments that dissolved in the 90s. And so that left homes in a position where they're seeking, capital financing through more traditional business models. And so that's why it's a real challenge today to continue to even redevelop an existing home or to receive the capital funding to construct a new one. So it often requires some additional assistance from provincial governments. You'll often see fundraising, or you'll see other types of models where there may be other forms of infrastructure included with the development of the long-term care home, like a retirement living model, for example. So there's still a lot of work to do in that space, but we do feel that there is a unique opportunity right now if we're able to work with CMHC again.
You said something that resonated with me, and most people don't know the extensive nature of our PSW, continuing care aid, all the different names for these programs, healthcare aid programs,
Hmm.
proctored exams, 400 hours of practical work during their 700 hours of studying. But in there, you talked about that your homes are places people live.
Hmm.
Your homes are places where people pass away as well. And our graduates spend a lot of time working on palliative care as well as they go through the program too. So that's a big part of that empathy and compassion that those workers and that your homes offer too, right?
Oh, for sure. Developing our workforce, and as we encourage people to consider a career in this field, that, there's a host of skills that's essential for people to have. But it's also extremely helpful for people to have or to know that you do need to have a caring aptitude because you are providing care and supporting quality of life for people who are in need of end of life care. And with that, those palliative approaches, understanding how to engage people, how to work with their families, how to support people through that anticipatory grieving process. And of course, the other aspect of this is also understanding, that you still need to care for yourself. As a caregiver, it can be challenging, when you have people that you've built relationships with, who are residents in the home who then pass. So it's it's an aspect of it to consider, but the rewarding aspect of this work is incredible. And often, what we hear in the media is, so often the negative stories are the ones that get told. But there really truly are, a million acts of beauty a day in long-term care homes, and those exchanges that happen between the residents and the staff that are so meaningful. And, in spite of the challenges, people who work in long-term care are there because it really matters, and there's so much fulfillment and meaning that they take from the work.
What a beautiful line, a million acts of beauty. I've had the good fortune of spending some of my volunteer time working in hospice and palliative care and sitting on a few panels. And I don't think there are greater heroes than those people. And until you go through it with someone, a family member, you don't realize just how amazing those people are. And
Absolutely.
they light it up again with a new patient and somehow get themselves through the days. I don't know how they do it. So let me go back. You've been good enough with your time. I'd like to talk about a couple of priorities your association has, because you're their
Yeah.
chief advocate and you do a good job. I see you running around Ottawa trying to create a stir during these difficult minority times when it's hard to get people's
Yeah.
attention. But you're
Yeah.
focused on a couple of things, if I'm correct. One is the passage of a safe long-term care act, and also doing some work around extending immigration programs for qualified healthcare professionals, which I think is applaudable, whether they're trained offshore or get trained in Canada. We're both focused on that issue. So I'm interested to hear a little bit about your priorities.
Yeah. So, as I had mentioned before, both levels of government in Canada, aside from the municipal governments, but federally and provincially, really have been engaged in long term care in a really robust way. And what is unique, perhaps, is what we've seen from the federal government. This particular government has been more deeply engaged than any other federal government in the past in long term care. So, they made a number of commitments, one being the development of national standards, which was completed, and another was to pass a Safe Long Term Care Act. And so for us, these are items that we have followed very closely and continue to do so as we see whatever is going to happen in Parliament at this time, and if actually a Safe Long Term Care Act will be introduced, and if it actually has time to get through the House. I know there's a lot of uncertainty about when an election will actually end up happening. So that's a key question. I think ultimately for us, when we think about national standards, and then as we think about what could be the contents of a Safe Long Term Care Act, that ultimately whatever is brought forward, it needs to be supported at the home level. So there needs to be the financial resources. There needs to be the capacity for additional staff education, if that's part of it. If there's more requirements on data, for example, there needs to be the funding streams that allow homes to be successful for them. So our advocacy in that space is very much about making sure that as we, it's not one level of government working out of alignment with a provincial government working out of alignment with the long-term care home sector itself. And that how do we find cohesion with all this so that we are making sure that ultimately we're able to advance quality of life and care for residents.
Amazing. Big issues, not easy issues. And we only have to look at the immigration file that's happened this year with international students to know there's no simple answers on any of that stuff we've got going on. So we try and keep this to 30 minutes. We're sitting here around 25, and I want to have you a moment to talk about a mentor in your life, because I focus on this because the career colleges that I work with, they've got class sizes of 8, 10, 12, 24 people, smaller classes, more intimate environments, and they create this bond with their students. It's intimate, and they long standing, almost like that teacher you had from high school because there was 20 of you in the class. What we used to get, right? When we're a vintage, that maybe that was our class size. So talk to me a little bit about, is there a mentor that's really had a huge impact on you?
Yeah, as I think about this, it's hard for me to pinpoint just one person because I've really been very fortunate to have more than one mentor that has come alongside me at different seasons in my life and different seasons of my career. One person that immediately comes to mind is a former boss, and I ended up working very closely with him. He was the CEO, and I think there was a succession planning that was occurring at that time. So he was bringing me to all of the tables that I normally wouldn't have been invited to, and really like kind of pushed away, made sure that I was front and center and that I had a voice and an opportunity to express myself. And just, when I think back on that time, it was more than just a succession plan. He was really teaching me leadership. And it just, I don't think I've had anyone sort of be such an advocate for me in making sure that I was at the table, that I had a voice, that my message was being heard and that of those I represented. And so that was a really powerful rapport that perhaps you wouldn't normally have with an employer. But after his retirement, that relationship has continued and continues to be a strong mentor with me. And perhaps another one that I would note that it's maybe a bit unusual is this is going back several years in my career. I was kind of providing research support to an expert panel that was having a look at aging and long term care in a particular province. And the chair of that panel was the past president of a university. And we just ended up really having a really strong rapport. And once that panel work was done, he continued to stay in contact with me. And he has really to this day become an extremely trusted advisor and someone that I know if I have a big decision to make or there's something that really is complex that I just need some help to kind of sort through, that he's someone that I can call and immediately they're available with their time and certainly their expertise to offer some perspective that sometimes you lose yourself. So those are just a couple of examples, but so many others that I think of that just it wasn't necessarily a lifelong mentorship, but it was a season where these people really offered me tremendous guidance and support, and I think are instrumental in the career that I have today.
It's nice to hear. We've all got those interactions, and we like to take a moment and talk about them because it is important that people realize that every day we can help educate. It's not about being in a classroom. It's about helping somebody with the skills you've got. And I jokingly say one of the best mentors I had was a boss I had who showed me how to not to do everything. Once I
Right.
learned if I did the opposite of what he did, I'd be pretty good. That was a different approach. So, Jodi, I want to thank you for joining us today to offer your opinions and your expertise. Long-term care is such an important issue in our country today, and we're always looking to share new solutions, new perspectives, and work with partners that are open-minded to working with us to find those solutions. And you've been one of those people. You're clearly a great leader for your sector. And I appreciate your time, not just today, but you've given me some thoughts and some advice as where the career colleges are going for training. And I think we found a bit of a kindred spirit on a few issues that we think we can work together as we go forward. So thank you very much for your leadership, for the audience. As always, thank you for listening. If there's anybody you'd like to hear from us, you're going to hear for the next couple of months a lot of healthcare stuff. We're talking about healthcare. It's so crucial to our sector that we need to get experts talking about these issues in a different format. So we're going to keep doing that. So if you'd like to hear from anything on those issues, reach out. And Jodi, I don't know if you have anything last you'd like to say before we sign off.
Yeah, well, maybe one more point that I'll make is just about the National Occupational Standard for Personal Care Providers. So it can be really challenging to see a consistent approach in sort of the scope of practice or scope of employment for a personal support worker. And that largely is because there's so much variation in when you look across the country in education or in sort of the duration of that. Some provinces have regulations and some do not. And so we end up with sort of a mixed model for that. And provinces are going to establish what works best for them in educating this occupational group. But there is something to be said about trying to create more uniformity and competency And so that's something that we've been very interested in is this national occupational standard from a competency point of view, because certainly for employers, it would be really helpful to maximize sort of the potential skill sets of personal support workers if there was greater alignment in that competency across the country.
Jodi, with that, and to our listeners, thank you again for joining the Ed Up Canada podcast. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Ed Up Canada podcast. We release new episodes regularly, so make sure you hit that subscribe button so you know when they are officially out. If you love this episode, please leave a 4- or 5-star review wherever you listen to your podcasts so that others can also discover how a set of skills can lead to success. Thanks for learning with us.